Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into one of the most controversial and defining events of modern history. The war launched by Russia in Ukraine, a war that was supposed to showcase Moscow's strength, but instead has revealed its deep weaknesses. In this video, we are going to break down the anatomy of this failed war and explain why Russia was destined to fail from the very beginning. When Russia invaded Ukraine, many experts believed that Kiev would fall within days. The Russian military was presented as the second most powerful in the world, capable of swift and decisive victories. Yet what followed was not a lightning strike, but a prolonged, grinding conflict that exposed the limits of Russia's military, political, and economic power. The failure was not accidental. It was embedded in the very foundations of how Russia prepared for and waged this war. At the heart of Russia's failure was overconfidence. Vladimir Putin and his inner circle miscalculated Ukraine's will to fight. They believed Ukrainian society would collapse, that its leaders would flee, and that its army would quickly disintegrate. Instead, Ukraine rallied around its government, with ordinary citizens taking up arms, forming territorial defense units, and refusing to surrender their sovereignty. This unexpected resilience turned Russia's quick strike invasion into a long, costly war of attrition. Another reason for the failure was Russia's flawed military strategy. The Kremlin relied on outdated doctrines rooted in Soviet-era thinking, assuming that massive artillery bombardments and overwhelming numbers would be enough to crush resistance. But modern warfare requires speed, coordination, precision, and flexible logistics. Russia struggled with all of these. Its troops advanced without proper supply lines, ran out of fuel, and were ambushed by smaller, more mobile Ukrainian units. Tanks were abandoned, convoys destroyed, and morale plummeted. The myth of Russia's unstoppable army began to collapse before the eyes of the world. Corruption within Russia's military, industrial complex also played a devastating role. For years, defense budgets were drained by cronies and oligarchs. Equipment was outdated, spare parts were missing, and soldiers often lacked basic supplies like food, proper uniforms, or working radios. While Russia showcased advanced weapons at parades, much of its actual arsenal was decades old. Once the fighting began, these weaknesses were impossible to hide. Ukrainian forces, with Western intelligence and precision weapons, exploited these flaws with devastating efficiency. Economics further doomed Russia's war effort. The Kremlin underestimated the global response. Western nations, though initially hesitant, unleashed massive sanctions, froze Russian assets, and cut off key technologies. Russia's economy became increasingly isolated, and its ability to replace high-tech components for modern weapons was crippled. The longer the war dragged on, the more Russia's economy bled, forcing it to rely on outdated stockpiles and imports from pariah states like North Korea and Iran. This economic isolation turned the war into a long-term burden that Russia could not sustain. Politically, Putin misread the international environment. He assumed NATO was weak, divided, and unwilling to act. Instead, the invasion united the West in ways not seen since the Cold War. NATO expanded its presence on Russia's borders. Countries like Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, and Ukraine received unprecedented levels of military and financial support. Rather than weakening NATO, Russia's war strengthened it, creating the exact outcome Putin wanted to avoid. Another key reason for Russia's destined failure was the nature of its leadership. Putin surrounds himself with loyalists, not truth-tellers. Advisors fed him only the information he wanted to hear, reinforcing his belief that Ukraine was weak and the West was paralyzed. This echo chamber blinded the Kremlin to reality. Decision-making became centralized and rigid, with little room for adaptation when the war didn't go according to plan. In contrast, Ukraine's leadership adapted quickly, empowered local commanders, and embraced modern tactics that leveraged Western training and equipment. The human factor was equally decisive. Ukrainian soldiers were defending their homes, families, and national survival. This gave them a powerful motivation that Russian conscripts simply lacked. Many Russian troops didn't even know why they were fighting. They were told they were on a special military operation, and not a war. As casualties mounted, morale sank, desertions increased, and trust in the Kremlin's leadership eroded. Wars are not only won with weapons, but with willpower, and in this regard, Ukraine held a decisive advantage. Technology also tilted the balance. While Russia relied heavily on brute force and artillery, Ukraine embraced precision, drones, and real-time intelligence. Western supplied HIMARS, Patriot systems, and long-range artillery changed the battlefield, allowing Ukraine to hit supply depots, command centers, and bridges deep behind Russian lines. Cheap drones became deadly tools for reconnaissance and strikes, outmaneuvering Russia's slower and less adaptive tactics. This technological edge magnified Russia's weaknesses and turned its traditional strengths into vulnerabilities. Russia's failures were also strategic on a global scale. Instead of reinforcing its status as a great power, the war diminished its influence. Countries once sympathetic to Russia grew wary of its aggression. China, though providing rhetorical support, has been cautious not to entangle itself too deeply. Many nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America see Russia as weakened and unreliable. By waging this war, Moscow isolated itself further, pushing Ukraine closer to the West and undermining its own long-term geopolitical goals. The internal consequences for Russia cannot be ignored. The war exposed deep cracks within Russian society. Hundreds of thousands of young men fled the country to avoid conscription. Sanctions limited access to Western goods and technologies, affecting daily life. Political dissent was crushed, but discontent simmered beneath the surface. Russia's elites, once able to enjoy luxury lifestyles in Europe, saw their assets frozen and their travel restricted. What was meant to project strength abroad instead created instability at home. Another layer of Russia's destined failure was its misunderstanding of modern information warfare. Moscow tried to control the narrative through propaganda, but the global information environment is too vast to dominate. Ukraine skillfully used social media, compelling imagery, and clear messaging to gain international sympathy and support. Russian narratives of denazification or liberation found little traction outside its domestic audience. By failing to control the global narrative, Russia lost the battle of legitimacy. As the war dragged on, time itself became Ukraine's ally and Russia's enemy. Each passing month allowed Ukraine to train more troops, receive more weapons, and integrate more closely with NATO standards. Meanwhile, Russia's pool of professional soldiers shrank, forcing it to rely on poorly trained conscripts and prisoners. The longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that Russia lacked the resources, strategy, and legitimacy to achieve its goals. One might argue that Russia's sheer size and nuclear arsenal still make it dangerous, and that is true. But nuclear weapons cannot win wars of occupation. To control territory, you need boots on the ground, motivated soldiers, stable supply lines, and the support, or at least acceptance, of the local population. Russia had none of these in Ukraine. Instead, it faced fierce resistance, international isolation, and its own internal decay. The anatomy of this failed war reveals that Russia's defeat was not just about battlefield mistakes, but about systemic weaknesses. Corruption, outdated doctrine, poor leadership, misjudged politics, and economic fragility all combined to ensure that this war could never succeed. Even if Russia manages to hold parts of Ukrainian territory, the strategic damage is already done. Its reputation as a military superpower is shattered, its economy weakened, and its geopolitical position eroded. Looking ahead, the consequences of this failure will shape global politics for decades. Ukraine has emerged as a symbol of resilience and national pride, while Russia is increasingly viewed as an aggressor in decline. NATO is stronger, Europe is more united, and the global balance of power has shifted. What began as an attempt to restore Russian dominance has instead accelerated its decline. Ultimately, this war teaches us that power built on illusions, corruption, and fear cannot stand against resilience, unity, and the determination of people fighting for their freedom. Russia was destined to fail not because Ukraine was stronger in size, but because Ukraine was stronger in spirit, better supported, and fighting for its very existence. And that is the anatomy of a failed war, a war Russia was doomed to lose the moment it began.